Welcome to the garden of freedom. No guards or garden, no walls, we don't need them. Make the world green again. We will make the world green again. This world is your world, the song is your song. The flag is unfurled, we will all sing along and make the world green again. We will make the world green again. Sing with us on the mountaintop. Sing with us in the valley. Sing with us, talk with us, stand with us, walk with us through the darkest alley. And make the world green again. We will make the world green again. Wherever your feet in this world of ours meet, right where you are, right under your star, make the world green again. We will make the world green again.
All right. Howie Hawkins has been with the Green Party since the very beginning here in the United States. And I've known him since the late 70s, I think, something like that.
National Committee for Independent Political Action.
Right, and we've been working on it ever since, and it's finally, I think we're starting to get a little bit of traction here and around the world, and it's about time. And Howie's you take Ohio, you can take the nation, so this is the start of that. So thanks for coming, and welcome.
Well, thank you, and thanks Logan for organizing this on short notice. I was in Chicago on yesterday, and I'm in West Virginia in a couple days speaking at West Liberty University. And this campaign, I'm pretty much on the road, and we said, well, there are a few days, and Ohio's in between, so and then Joe Manchin wanted to do some petitioning. So thanks for setting this up on short notice. Thanks, Bob, for hosting this, and thanks everybody for coming. I didn't expect to be here. This brother was saying he wasn't going to retire to a rocking chair. Actually, I wanted to retire to an easy chair, catch up on my reading. I've been buying books faster than I can read them my whole life, and a couple books I have in mind about writing. And last year, after I finished up at, working at UPS, got my Teamsters pension, although thanks to Joe Biden and some Democrats and Republicans, it was cut 20%. And actually worked a little extra so it wouldn't be cut 30%. This is the New York State Teamsters Fund. They changed the ERISA, doesn't protect us in multi-employer pension funds anymore. And Congress didn't want to help. Bernie Sanders had a good proposal to top off those funds, but it didn't go anywhere. So Green said, can't retire yet, run for governor. And a very frustrating campaign with Trump on everybody's mind. People were voting for Andrew Cuomo, a corporate Democrat, to send a message to Trump. Didn't make any sense. But it was a difficult year. We got the ballot line back. So I could have gone back to work at UPS because they cut my pension. They said, well, the consolation is you can work up to 1,000 hours a year at your old job. What they didn't advertise was that you lose all your seniority and you start over. I would have started over at the minimum wage in New York, which was $10.40. Governor's touting $15 minimum wage that he said he got. Well, upstate, no. We were at $10.40 at that point. And we only get to $12.50, and then they're going to look at it again about 2021. So, that's what the Democrats do. They take our programs and, say they did them, and they really didn't. So I was looking forward to debating Cuomo. Where's my $15 minimum wage? But he wouldn't debate me this time. I mean, we've had previous debates. So I took a job at the post office, casual mail handler, started at 18, 12-hour shifts. I get 27 an hour for 4 of those hours. So I go to work, go to the gym, go to sleep, back to work. I did that for 2 months. Even Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's. I got 3 days off, but they weren't holidays. And then I opened my email, and there's a whole lot of people saying, Howie, you should run for president. And it was people, it was hard to say no to, like the late Bruce Dixon, you know, was a good friend of mine. And we talked on the phone, and I couldn't really argue. I couldn't beat the argument. And then, you know, Matt Gonzalez in California, the almost mayor of San Francisco back about 15 years ago, and a whole lot of people in between. And more than that, this Draft Howie committee actually had pulled a campaign together. I mean, they had the whole thing together. I really couldn't say no. So took me a while to wrap my head around it, but I'm now doing it, and I'm enjoying it, you know, meeting Greens all over the country. And what I'm really trying to do is help the Green Party get better organized. I think we exist because we're needed. You know, most of us, not my particular history, it goes back to the 60s. I was never for the Democrats or the Republicans from 64, and I could tell you that story, but I won't. But a lot of people, you know, they want to oppose a war, and they find out the Democrats are for it. Or like Jill Stein, you know, she was lobbying the Democrats, public health, environmental health as a doctor, and realized how corrupt it was. And then they did a citizens initiative and won a referendum to get public campaign finance. And then the Democratic legislature, overwhelmingly Democrat in Massachusetts, said, well, we're not going to do that. We'll pass our own campaign finance law, which was the same old crap, private campaign financing. That was it for Jill. You know, people fight these fracking and the new pipelines, you know, for gas and oil. And suddenly they realize the Democrats are not their friends. They're for all of the above, which means fracking the hell out of the country and subsidizing nuclear power. That's their all of the above energy policy, which they just reaffirmed last August after having apparently by mistake decided they weren't going to take fossil fuel money. You heard about that, right? Christine Pelosi, the Speaker's daughter, snuck that through in June, and by August they said, oh no, we're going to take that fossil fuel money and we're recommitting to the all of the above energy policy, which even Bill McKibben, who's very oriented to the Democrats, he had to go in the New York Review of Books and explain himself, you know, why he's still supporting Democrats. So so here I am. And so we need to build the party. And so what my campaign's trying to do really until the convention is get on the damn ballot. This country's ballot access laws are the most onerous, except for a couple exceptions, of all the electoral democracies in the world. You want to run for Congress in Ohio without a ballot line, it's 3,400 signatures, right? In New York, it's 3,500 signatures in 6 weeks. In Illinois, it's 15 to 17,000, depending on the district. And I could go through a bunch of states. You want to run for the House of Commons in England, it's 10 signatures. In Canada, it's 50 to 100, depending on the size of the riding. You know, that's their congressional district or their House of Commons district. In India, you need one person to sign an affidavit that you're not stark raving crazy. And they have, you know, the biggest electoral democracy in the world. In this country, party suppression is part of voter suppression. You know, basically the bottom half of the income spectrum votes in low proportion, and people say they're apathetic. No, they're alienated. And I've done a lot of door knocking. There's a Teamster that I worked with for 20 years. He's still not registered. He says, I don't want to give them my name. I don't want to affirm what they're doing. They don't care about me. They don't know my problems. I'm just not going to have nothing to do with it. But every time an issue's in the news, I get to work. He wants my opinion on what's going on. He's following the news. He cares what happens. He just doesn't think voting can make any difference. And that's why I think the Green Party has a future. If we can get the working class people organized, they're the ones voting in the least amount. People of color, youth, that's the future. So we don't exist because we've been good organizers. We exist because we've been needed, because people get disappointed in the more progressive of the two parties, the Democrats, and they come to the Greens. Damn it, we'll just run with the Greens. But what we need to do is learn how to organize, build organizations that can sustain ourselves, build organizations that know the kinds of things a community organizer or a union organizer knows how to do. Like, how do you reach a community that's not involved in the party? Like, the Green Party is mostly white in most places, so they say, we got to get the black folks here, but so what they do, they take the palm card and say, here's a good program, join us. But an organizer would say, let's find out what people are thinking, what their issues are. Let's listen and then help them and build relationships, because the black-white bridge is a big part is a trust issue. So you got to get to know people. And then there was a story that was written up in the Washington Post about a year ago about a black woman in Wilmington, North Carolina, working in a factory, and there's the white guy who's head of the Klan, and they got issues. They both got issues with the way things are going down in the factory. So she went up to him and said, "How can I help?" And he was a little bit taken aback, but they started working together and built a relationship to the point where he got out of the Klan and was working with her, in organizing around shop issues. That's what an organizer does. These are the kinds of things we need to learn as Greens, and not just be activists. I mean, I go around and in a lot of places, the Greens are known as activists. We show up. When there's something happening, they tell the Greens, and we'll show up. But we're not so good at organizing the campaigns, initiating campaigns. And then we got the problem, you've probably experienced it here, we do all over, is that they want us to show up, but they don't want us speaking. Because the funded groups are kind of tied to the Democrats when you trace the money back. And there's sort of career paths there that interact with the career paths in the Democratic Party. And we're kind of like, they want our bodies, but not our voices. So, we got to figure out how to organize around that and do mass organizing, not just pulling the usual suspects. So, in addition to putting money into petitioners and getting on the ballot, we want to do some organizing training and do regional trainings where people can come and learn a lot of these things, from electoral campaigning, which we're going to want to do in the fall. You ID voters, you keep a list, you communicate with them and get them out to vote. One of the things we need to be doing is taking names. Because of that rain out there, I didn't bring in my sign-up sheet, but I want to get to that at some point so we can stay in touch with you. So it's really an organizing campaign. Of course, there are issues, and on this palm card, why don't we just pass them around? There's a long laundry list of issues on the back, and we do that because people want to see if we're addressing their issue, and even on all that small print, we can't address all the dozens of issues. But there are really 3 issues that I'm emphasizing. I call them the life and death issues, and then there's one more, and that's the question we'll get when we're on the ballot, we've got a nominee, and then, the media, and of course the Democrats are going to promote this question, why are you spoiling the election? We got to get rid of Trump. Of course, our answer is we're improving the election. We're bringing things up so you can't split the vote, like a national popular vote with ranked choice voting. The Democrats have lost to the last 2 Republicans who got in office. When they first got in office, they didn't win the popular vote. You'd think the Democrats would want to do something about that, right? In fact, Hillary Clinton in New York, when she first got elected to the Senate, had a news conference. I'm going to get rid of the Electoral College. She got a nice news story and then dropped the whole issue, never followed up. That's why we need the Greens in the race, because we bring up issues that others won't, that need to be brought up. That's the whole tradition of third parties in this country. They bring issues to the fore, going back to the Liberty Party and abolition, through the populists and the socialists. And, the Democrats sometimes adopt our programs, although they kind of screw it up. Roosevelt adopted a lot of things in the socialist platform. And it's an apocryphal story. He didn't actually say this to Norman Thomas, but Norman Thomas gave a speech about it. And, the apocryphal story is, so they met and Roosevelt said, "What do you think, Norman Thomas? I carried out your program." And Norman Thomas said, "Yeah, on a stretcher. It's not socialism, it's, New Deal liberalism, which keeps the capitalists in power." So, socialism, that's basically the theme of my campaign, an eco-socialist Green New Deal. And we address these 3 life and death issues, and I'll wrap up with these. Of course, the climate crisis. That's number 1. And I happen to be the first candidate in this country to run on a Green New Deal in 2010. We started in the spring. This was to get the ballot line in New York. They ran me for governor. And we had a slate that ran on it. And pretty soon, across the country, people started, "This is great. We want to run on it too." And by August, we had a statement of 62 Green candidates around the country. And at the federal level, we added to the things we could do at the state level, like cut the military budget, we said by 70%, and put that money into a clean energy transition, peace conversion. And, like Ralph Nader used to say, let's be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of its global military empire, and make friends instead of enemies. I mean, we could do a lot more with our resources by that kind of approach. So, just on the climate thing, it's been the signature issue of the Green Party for the last decade. We ran on it in New York, and then Greens around the country, then Jill Stein ran on it 2 campaigns. And we've run it on our state races. I'm sure people here in Ohio have used that slogan and that idea, which is not just the energy transition, it's the economic Bill of Rights, the rights to a job, an income above poverty, a home, good health care, education, and a secure retirement. And this program, I watched the European Greens. I didn't think this up myself, although in 2000, the Green Party USA, when we were split, we had a plank called the Global Green Deal. I wanted to call it the Global Green New Deal, but they wouldn't let me say New Deal. That was too damn Democratic Party. But in 2010, the Greens, I convinced them that, yeah, Cuomo was running on austerity, and he was saying, I'm the real Tea Party candidate. He was adapting to the environment then. And the Republican was a guy named Crazy Carl Palladino, who makes Trump look like a nice liberal. He's a buddy of Trump, a real estate developer in Buffalo, and really, he's even nastier than Trump, if you can believe that. So we called it the Hawkins austerity plan versus the the Hawkins prosperity plan versus the Cuomo austerity plan. And it was as much about the economic Bill of Rights as the clean energy, because we're coming out of the housing and financial collapse and trying to get the economy going. And it was our answer to austerity. So that remains an important part of the Green New Deal, and it's got to be, because I think that's how we're going to build the coalition to get the energy piece done, because people want to be reassured that they're going to not lose their jobs and go through hardship as we make this transition to a clean energy economy. So I believe that's essential. And so funny thing happened after this last election. You know, the Sunrise Movement went to Pelosi's office and got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to show up, and they did a little sit-in and said, we want a Green New Deal. And the media loved it. They ate it up. It went viral. They did a poll. 80% of the public, more than 80%, wanted a Green New Deal, including 64% of Republicans. So now it's on the agenda. Unfortunately, as often happens, the Democrats took the brand and diluted the content. Pelosi killed the select committee, which would have been able to put legislation on the floor. And that was killed before it even got into session. So they came back with a non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal, thinking, well, let's just get on the record that this is a good idea. Pelosi's never let them vote on it. And then in the Senate, McConnell said, sure, half you Democrats are running for president, let's get you on the record. And then Markey and Schumer said, oh, this is a trick. They won't let us do expert testimony and build support. So Schumer said, vote present. And all the good little Democrats did, except for it, and voted with the Republicans no on the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal has already been killed by the Democratic Party, and it was a watered-down version. They removed, like what we've been talking about, is like the leading immediate demand is to ban fracking and all new fossil fuel infrastructure. They didn't mention that. They didn't mention anything about nuclear power. We were saying phase out nukes rapidly. Nothing about cutting the military budget. And they extended the deadline. We were talking 2030. They extended it to 2050. They say electricity by 2030 and the rest by 2050. Well, electricity is only 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So, and if you look at the carbon budgets, like that young woman, Greta Thunberg, taught the people in the UN last week, we can't wait for the other 72% till 2050. We'll be cooked. And in fact, in 2010, we were saying 2020. That was our demand, 100% by 2020. We got to say 2030 now because we're a decade later, which means we got to draw more carbon out of the atmosphere, and we can talk about how to do that. So anyway, the Democratic leadership tried to kill the Green New Deal, but it won't die. All the presidential candidates got to talk about it. All the environmental movements have embraced it. And of course, the Green Party's raising it. So now we've got these proposals, and I'll just say briefly, none of the Democrats' proposals are serious. They're an order of magnitude, a zero or a decimal point too short. They're all $3 trillion over 10 years or less. Now, Bernie Sanders came out with $16.3 trillion over 10 years. And I just posted on my website a budget I've been working on with a political economist who's been working on this for a decade, John Wren, of $27 trillion for the energy piece over 10 years. And the difference between Sanders and us is that he goes to 2050 on all the sectors except electricity. We're doing it all by 2030. He doesn't show his homework. We do in you can go online, you click on the budget line, and you can read our rationale for that number of jobs, number of manufacturing jobs, and the total cost. And that's what it'll take based on the technology we got and the number of jobs we will create by these different forms of investment. And the other thing that distinguishes our Green New Deal, the Democratic ones, that first they don't put enough public money into it. There's no way they're going to do the conversion They talk about leveraging private money, but it's mostly market incentives, regulations, and with the big businesses, the fossil fuel industry and the utilities and so forth still in power, they're going to make it difficult to carry this program through. We're saying it has to come out of the public sector, like during World War II, when the federal government took over or built a quarter of the manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into what they called the arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascists. We got to do nothing less to defeat climate change. So we're talking not just like about energy, which Bernie does talk about public ownership, or at least expanding public ownership. We're talking about the whole railroad system, from intercity high-speed rail, electrified freight rail, and then the trolleys that we used to have and lost almost a century ago or by the 30s. Rebuilding them so we have light rail in all our cities and towns. We need a federal administration to do that. And then manufacturing. And what we'll do there, instead of it being a publicly administered system, it would be publicly owned, and then we lease the factories to worker co-ops. Unlike World War II, where they built all this stuff and then they gave it back to the super rich and their big corporations, pennies on the dollar. So GM may have been partially expropriated and planned, and the owners were irrelevant for a period, but then they gave it all back to the owners. We would give it to the working people so that we'd have a more equitable distribution. Which gets to the second life or death issue, inequality. Inequality has been growing steady since the early 70s. Capitalism is back to its normal operation. I think the period after World War II until the early 70s was an anomaly. If you look at the history of capitalism, we can talk about the reasons why our wages grew in concert with productivity gains for a brief period of a couple decades or 2.5 decades, and then it stopped. So now we all get a fixed wage, and all the surplus goes to the rich, and that's the way it's been. And inequality kills. We have this study out, American Medical Association published, the life expectancy gap between our richest and poorest counties is 20 years. And if you break it down by census tracts, it's even greater. And, you know, people don't get medical attention they need because they're afraid of the cost of the drugs or the co-pays or the deductibles. You know, they're not good grocery stores in the poor neighborhoods. The food isn't as good. People are stressed out, you know, the public transportation is not available. In my neighborhood, half the people don't have a car. They either walk or take the bus to work, and those buses in Syracuse are terrible. I mean, I'll get in my car, drive out of the neighborhood downtown, come back an hour and a half later, and people are still waiting at the bus for that same people at the bus stop. It's just terrible. So that's where the economic Bill of Rights comes in. That's where reparations, we can talk about that, comes in. And the two major parties don't have a program. I mean, for them, it's all about stimulating the economy, growth, and trickle down. Both parties are trickle down economics, just a little bit different approaches to it, but they don't have solutions to that problem. And then the third problem is life and death, that I hope the Green Party can put on the agenda that is not on the agenda, and that's this new nuclear arms race. The United States initiated a modernization, multi-trillion-dollar modernization of all the strategic forces, submarine, land-based, air. They're going to be hypersonic, 6 times faster than they were, which means you launch on warning. I mean, you don't even have time to check it out. And we've come close to launching because we got false alarms, and it was only like 20 minutes. You know, there's a famous case where Brzezinski called up Carter and said, "Be ready," and then 3 minutes before Carter was going to do the football, they found out it was a false alarm. And you got to read Daniel Ellsberg's second Pentagon paper. It's called The Doomsday Machine, and realize that that football the president carries around is more for us, our reassurance, than the reality, because theater commanders have authorization to launch, and even field commanders in, you know, like Marine Corps artillery officers, they have tactical nukes, and in certain circumstances they could use them, or they could be rogue and use them. And we are now miniaturizing, putting more of these tactical nukes into conventional forces, as if you launch them and you're going to not go to strategic and, you know, be the end of all of us. That's where we're at. The treaties we got out of ABM in 2003 and the framework for North Korea. This year we got out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Next up is the START treaty, New START, which is the Strategic Arms Treaty. And now we're in a nuclear arms race. Russia is duplicating us. China and India, which had policies of no first use and minimum credible deterrent, are deciding they may have to drop them because they're worried about being wiped out in a first strike. It's really crazy. And meanwhile, 122 nations agreed to a treaty, the wording, called the Treaty for the Abolition or the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons 2 years ago. And the campaign, the international campaign to get that adopted, got the Nobel Peace Prize. Very few of us know that. I bet less than 1 in 1,000 Americans know that. So the rest of the world is very concerned. Unfortunately, none of the nuclear powers participated in drafting that treaty. So what I hope Greens will raise is we pledge no first use. A few of the Democrats have they've sponsored it in Congress, but it's not on their campaign websites. They're not making an issue of it. Unilaterally disarm to a minimum credible deterrent. So we put other nations at ease and slow down this arms race, and then get serious about negotiating complete global nuclear disarmament, which has been in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's one of the 3 provisions. Stop the proliferation, spread the peaceful atom. I don't like that part, but negotiate complete nuclear disarmament, and it's never been pursued seriously. Gorbachev and Reagan kind of got there, but really didn't, and it hasn't happened. And now we got this new treaty. I think if nothing else, the Greens can put that on the agenda between, the presidential campaign after the convention next summer and our congressional candidates, and even our city council candidates. We should be passing resolutions in city council to get away from this nuclear madness. So there are issues, and that's why we need the Green Party to put these on the table. And so I guess the last thing I'll do is, as they used to say on Earth First, the usual disgusting plea for money. What I'm asking people to do is think about, my campaign is helping people get on the ballot. We're really putting resources into organizing. And we're going for the matching funds, which means we need $5,000 in 20 states of contributions of $250 or less. And up to $250 will be matched by Uncle Sam when we qualify. And we've done that. Jill did it twice. Renator did it. We expect to do it all. It's tough, in this Trump year, a lot of people that might give to us are, back in Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard or Mike Revelle for a while. So what I'm urging people to do is, see if they can't hit $250 before this is over. Some people can write that check right now. Others need to get a recurring donation. And I was down in Texas, and we looked up what the starting wage at McDonald's was. It was $8. So I did the calculation. I pay 2.5 hours wages as a Teamster a month. And that was a lot more than $8. It was 20-something dollars. But at $8 a month, $8 an hour, 2.5 hours wages is $20 a month. And if you start the recurring donation now, you get pretty close to $250 by the Green Convention next July. So think about it that way. We contribute to our unions, our co-ops. We need to do the same thing for our politics, our party. Or otherwise, nobody's going to fund us but us. We don't want the corporate money because we don't want to be bought and controlled by them like the Democrats and Republicans are. So I have donation forms here. You can go onto my website and do the recurring donation electronically. If you want to give a check or cash, I'll just put the donation cards out here, and at some point you can pick one up if you want to donate tonight. We do need the information about employer and occupation, retired or unemployed works, because the FEC won't match you unless you provide that information. So, and cash, the most we can take is $100 cumulative. So
That counts towards a matching fund.
yeah, the cash counts, the check counts, the
Now, a
digital.
fundraiser, if you did a fundraiser, that doesn't.
No, it counts, but the individual don't. We want to attribute the donations to individuals.
Sure.
You throw money in a basket, that doesn't count.
Sure.
So if it's $1, we want to identify it. So we get $2 from your $1. So that's pretty much a summary of what I'm trying to do. I hope I kept it to 15 minutes. And
Close enough?
okay, good.
So we want to take some questions. Go ahead.
Mr. Hawkins, have you heard of modern monetary theory?
Yep.
I assume then you realize the implications.
Well, I think I know the implications. I'm not sure everybody that talks about modern monetary theory does, but basically what I understand is they're saying as long as the dollar is a reserve currency, we can borrow as much money as we want.
We can trade as much money as we want, really. And
Well,
this eviscerates the argument, where we're going to find the funding for a Green New Deal.
yeah. Technically, you're borrowing the money.
Okay.
You're not printing it. The Treasury Department issues a bond.
Right.
It gets bought on the market. The Fed can support that by buying its secondary market.
That's true.
And in the end, that Treasury, all those Treasuries got to be paid off. So they're linked to debt. And if you go to my Green New Deal, we got a discussion of this.
Okay.
And basically, between the 2.7 trillion a year for the green economy reconstruction, going through power, agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, and buildings, and then the Economic Bill of Rights, which is recurring about 1.4 trillion a year to cover all those programs from healthcare to education and job guarantee. We get about 2.2 trillion for more progressive taxation, and we get up to 1.3 or 4 trillion from either borrowing or the old greenback proposal. You change the monetary system so the Treasury can actually issue the greenbacks, as we did during the Civil War. And that money's not linked to debt. So it's a better program, I believe. But the other argument I say is we can't wait to make that monetary reform happen. If we have to, we borrow it. And we call it green quantitative easing. Instead of bailing out the banks, this time we bail out the people on the planet.
Sounds good.
And then the other part of it is, and Bernie Sanders, I appreciate the fact that his Green New Deal points this out. He says the program will pay for itself over time by the electricity sales in the public sector. Well, we're talking about electricity sales, public housing rents, transportation fares, green machinery leases or sales, and some other public program. Internet, we're going to do universal internet and the digital divide, and so there's a fee, to get your internet. And what we say is some of these things we may want to offer below cost, like public transportation, or especially in the early years, the renewable energy versus the dirty energy, in order to incentivize their use. So, but in the end, I believe the program will pay for itself. It is a productive investment. It's not a financial investment like most of the rich people are doing now. They're not building new productive assets. They are buying stocks and bonds and rearranging the productive assets we already got, and in the process further concentrating them. So, yeah, I think the modern money theory has basically made a good argument that don't worry about the debt if it's a good investment.
Right.
The thing that I think some people read that, they're not understanding that in the end we're going to have to pay it off, the Treasury bonds, because it's under the current monetary system. So the Greens have had this program. It's very radical. I consider it the modern version of the old, Greenback Labor and People's Party proposal for greenbacks. And the Green Party of the U.S. and also England and Wales have it in their platform. But it's a radical idea.
Hi, Howie. My wife and I just met you, but I've heard a lot about you, and we've seen the videos of you being interviewed on different media. So I thank you, first of all, for running, because my own belief is that you represent what the average voter is looking for, not just promises, but definite plans. But here's what I'd like to bring up, among many other things, but myself and another Green in our room here, she ran for governor, is Connie Goodell Newton. Both she and I are type 1 diabetics. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard not only me talk about it, but it's been all over the media, where type 1 diabetics, because of this wonderful Obamacare, they claim it's wonderful, they no longer qualify to be under their parents' plan. And literally, a young man who lives 2 hours south of Columbus, his mother came to testify at a forum that a Democratic legislator in the Columbus area, Dr. Liston, had. But she's already getting roadblocks from her own party. But the only proviso is her legislation would only cover people that are insured by insurance companies. So that's kind of crazy, because this poor guy lost his insurance. He was 27 years old. He couldn't afford the insulin because it's so expensive. And he literally died in July of this year. So I'd like your thoughts on what you believe you can do about big pharma and the controlling the cost of a simple medication that only costs $2 to $3 to make by these big pharma companies, but they're selling it to people who don't have insurance for about $300 to $350.
Yeah, the guy who lived downstairs from me needed kidney medicine, and he was a black man about 6 years old, went to segregated schools, couldn't read, or he was innumerate as well. He had just had to rely on the corner store to give him the right change. Really nervous about paying his rent and utilities, so he had Medicaid, and they told him you got to buy this medicine. He didn't buy his medicine, and his kidneys failed this spring. And I know he was sick, and I said, well, I thought he had the flu. And then his cousin said, no, he didn't buy his medicine. That keeps being repeated. And the diabetes thing is the cost of insulin going up is outrageous. So, I'm for a single payer, in other words, publicly funded. I think single payer is kind of a goofy word, but it's publicly funded health care. And it should cover your drugs. Given that the drug companies are so damn irresponsible, they will gouge people and kill them. And they're not doing the research and development on the things we really need to worry about, like drug-resistant diseases. They are looking for the next Viagra, because that's something, you get a preventative medicine, you use it once, you don't make a lot of money off it. But Viagra, or whatever, those drugs you get dependent on, you got to buy over and over and over again. So we're not doing the research we need to do. The National Institute for Health does most of it, funds most of it. So I think they should be public enterprises under public control. As far as what kind of publicly funded system I'm for, I would, if I was president, I would sign, the Sanders bill, even though I got problems with it, the JPEL bill, not as good as McDermott's was before, 676. They've been making little compromises with the insurance industry and the Medicare Advantage people and so forth. But what I want to get back to is, back in the 70s, we had 3 health care bills to choose from. The Nixon plan, which was basically employer mandate, kind of like Obamacare. We had the Kennedy bill, which was national health insurance, what today we call single payer. And then we had the Dellums bill, which the Medical Committee for Human Rights that had patched people up during the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement worked with. And it was public hospitals, clinics, doctors on salary, locally elected boards that administered the system locally and federated at the state and national level. And there was a famous article written by John Ehrenreich and Oliver Fine, and they called the Kennedy bill the Great Leap Sideways, because you'd have a public insurance system and the drug companies and the income maximizing providers, hospitals and so forth, would be feeding at the public trough. You wouldn't be able to control costs as well. Or to get resources allocated, because if it's in the market like that, the hospitals will want to gear toward the upscale market. So the poor communities will be underserved with clinics and so forth. That's why you need the community control. So this has been, the Dellums bill Barbara Lee carried until Obamacare passed, and then she didn't reintroduce it. It's called the Josephine Baker United States Health Service Bill, or Act. And you can Google it and read how it would be administered. And I think we need to bring that back. In fact, AOC blurted out that she wanted the VA for everybody. The VA is a service, but it's only for veterans who qualify. So I want to write her a letter. Why don't you bring this Josephine Baker bill back? I'll get to that one of these days. I'm very curious to see what kind of response I get. Mike Gravel, if you read his platform, he said, I'll sign the Medicare for all, but we got to get to a health service. And I had dinner with him last Friday night, and we talked about that. And, I really admire that guy. He put the Pentagon Papers in the congressional record when the Supreme Court was considering whether to uphold the injunction against the Times publishing it. And, ever since then, he's just been somebody who had integrity. So it was really an honor to meet with him. And the thing that really, struck me when I read his platform this time was he wanted to bring back the Dellums bill. So I think we need a public system, as one person calls it, publicly funded, publicly administered, and publicly delivered. So not just the public health insurance, but what is really socialized medicine.
Questions? Looks like we may be going to war with Iran, maybe. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, it would be a terrible idea. I happen to think Trump doesn't want to start a war when he's about to try to run for re-election. And Bolton has gone there's still crazies in the administration. I'm not so worried they're going to do that. They're doing other stupid things, like they just killed 30-day laborers in Afghanistan with a drone. You know, and people didn't pay attention to it. And then there was another thing that happened like the next day, I forget. But we're bombing 7 countries right now. I mean, we don't need to start another war. We're already involved in a bunch of them. I'm calling for 75% cut in military spending, rapidly bringing troops home from foreign deployments. As long as NATO is not just a defensive alliance, but the way to get around the UN and overthrow governments, we need to, reconsider our relationship to NATO. And basically, like I said earlier, put the money into helping people rather than exploiting them. I mean, the military is there to make the world safe for global corporations, particularly U.S.-based ones. And, that all that does is lead to war. Now, I would argue that, another reason to get beyond capitalism, it's a competitive system. It has to grow and destroy the environment, because each firm, if they don't get bigger and get bigger market share, they're going to lose out in the competition, so the whole system grows like cancer. It's also competitive, so every big company that's, trying to make money overseas tries to enlist their military to keep, repressive governments in place so the labor is cheap and exploited, and the environmental regulations aren't there, and that doesn't do anybody any good. So, yeah, we got to stop fighting wars and we need a global Green New Deal. Again, I'll give Bernie props for, he wants the U.S. to fulfill its obligation to what's called the Green Development Fund that the UN set up at the Denmark, Copenhagen climate action thing. But I forget the numbers. The U.S., I think it's 200 billion. Anyway, Bernie committed 200 billion over 10 years. We committed $1 trillion. Because another thing we got to face, and I give Bernie credit for this, he's been saying this is an international problem. He mentions $1.5 trillion or more a year spent on the military. We need to convert that to fighting this climate and or funding this energy transition. And we got to face the fact that, Russia's out of its mind. Putin is a climate denier like Trump. He just launched a barge with 2 nuclear power plants. Went out the Baltic. It's going across Siberia, going to park towards Alaska. First of 7 of these to power oil and gas drilling in the Arctic Ocean. You wonder what could go wrong. They just had a nuclear accident they were trying to have a nuclear powered missile, which the U.S. was doing in the 50s and I think decided was kind of crazy. They haven't done it since then. And in China's Belts and Roads Initiative, they're doing a lot of solar around Beijing and these other very polluted cities because people are choking to death. But the Belts and Roads Initiative, the plan is 700 coal-fired plants to power that, across Asia and Africa and Europe. India's fossil fuel emissions are growing at 5% a year. And the doubling time of that is like 10 years or something. It's really fast. So we got to help. It's going to have to be very sophisticated diplomacy and economic incentives and partnerships. I'm very critical of China's social credit is a very Orwellian kind of, what I'm talking about, the social credit surveillance, and you get a score, and then that determines whether you can go to school or get credit or, even move internally in the country. It's very, Orwell would be turning in his grave. So can be very critical there, but I don't think that the way to approach that is like we did with the TPP. We wanted to get everybody in the Pacific against China. We should have brought China into the tent and found a way so that both sides benefit from trade agreements. And I think that's a more productive way to, help them. The Belts and Roads Initiative, if that's, their industrial policy and their plan, even though you can criticize it, for economic imperialism, we can talk about that, but at least power it, with clean energy, not coal. And, and Russia's the same thing. They're a petro state. They're dependent on fossil fuels. Okay, well, we're a rich country and we all live on the same planet. Let's find a way to help them make the transition, as well as, I think in that process, most of the countries of the world at these UN climate, summits have been pushing harder because they're the ones suffering from, sinking or rising oceans, coastal areas, droughts, And, so they want better climate action. They also want help because they're not the ones that put the carbon in the atmosphere in the first place. They're sort of the victims of it. So I guess that's an argument for international socialism. But that's, I think, what we got to be looking at, finding how we can be in solidarity with those around the world. Like there are environmentalists in Russia that are fighting this, nuclear initiative and the nuclear weapons. There's a peace movement, but it's difficult to organize over there.
Our cameraman has a question.
Yeah.
In your literature, you mention workers' cooperatives. Do you have a plan to implement that, or how do you envisage that being brought to fruition?
Well, I think the federal government should have a program to provide technical assistance and financing to initiate new cooperatives, help retiring owners sell it to their workers, help, like I was talking about the Green New Deal, we're going to build all these factories. They don't have to all be run by a central administration. They could be leased out to worker cooperatives. But you need training to operate a worker cooperative as workers, know what your rights are, what kind of, special people. The workers hire the board or elect a board, then you want a board that will hire the right kind of people that have management skills for coordination, bookkeeping, counting, that sort of thing. And also planning the future of the business, so you're adapting to changes in the market. Or, the plan. We should have a bigger plan sector. That's our whole argument for our Green New Deal. We got to plan the transition like we did during World War II to build the arsenal of democracy. We got to do the same thing to build a clean energy system. So now the question is, what agency would do it? You were suggesting the Department of Labor. Somebody yesterday was saying it should be the Small Business Administration. I don't know what the answer to that one is, but I think it should be a federal program. And it should also have, it shouldn't just be something you got to write to Washington to get help. There should be offices around the country so people can get hands-on technical assistance near where they are.
Go ahead. You.
We are having a lot of economic inequality these days, and there's a lot of trouble with homelessness and housing, and people who have a house and then they're evicted, like my niece and her boyfriend. His disability got revoked, and he was taking care of his two sons and their girlfriends and his two daughters in one house. And they all lost their home. Boom! They all scattered, and some of them are homeless.
They lost it because what?
Well, because he lost his disability check. They took away.
Oh.
He had a bad back, and so for a while.
So he wasn't able to pay the mortgage?
No, it was rent. See, he had
It
a
was rent.
$700 rent for like a 4-bedroom place in
Couldn't pay the rent.
up on 15th Avenue, or no, 17th, 16th. And it was a big house, and his family needed that big house. And now he's with his mother, and everybody else is like scrambling, or my niece is on the street.
Yeah, I just got a tour of Skid Row in LA. It's like 50,000 people living in tents on the street. Yeah, and the rent's too damn high everywhere. It's pushing people out. The private housing market has never provided affordable housing. And we pulled away from public housing since really the end of the Johnson administration, with acceleration through Nixon and Reagan, especially Clinton. And the public housing we did do after World War II was done the wrong way. It was segregated for people of color, isolated from transportation jobs, and it increased segregation. So what I'm saying is we should have a public housing program, and we got to build. This was a demand of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in '63, the freedom budget that came out of that, and the Poor People's Campaign. Build enough public housing until everybody has an affordable home. And it's a big jobs program. It can be a clean energy program, because we're going to build, it'll be powered by, wind, sun for the power, heat and cool with electric heat pumps. It can sequester carbon with the building materials. We can, along with rebuilding the trolley systems, the light rail systems in our cities, and locating public housing apartments, we can build walkable communities so that we have a better urban design. There's a whole lot of things we can do with the housing program. In the meantime, we need universal rent control federally. We did it during World War II when we put all the money into the Arsenal of Democracy. There wasn't money going into housing, so they put rent controls on. AOC just introduced a bill for maximum 3% a year rise, which is better than the bill they got in California and bills in California and Oregon, which maximizes the increase at 7%. Which, you know, I guess it will protect some people, but it's still a pretty high hike.
That's 3 times inflation.
Yeah, and wages aren't going up that fast. So we need that. And then the other thing is, I think we need to prosecute and claw back all the homes and wealth stolen by the predatory lenders, these racists that targeted blacks and Latinos and Asians for subprime loans when they were qualified for regular loans, and then targeted them again for foreclosures when the market collapsed and what they owed was way above what the house was worth now. They were underwater. You know, the Obama administration, you know, Holder basically said they're too big to jail. And Geithner said he had $75 billion, and the banks would have got paid for the difference between what the market rate was and what it was now. They only spent 15 of those billion. And that's because the banks, he said, I got to foam the runway for the banks. Well, the foam was those people who lost their homes, 14 million homes. And so who's in the White House now? I mean, yeah, the White House now in the cabinet. You got Steve Mnuchin that ran One West, one of the worst predatory lenders and foreclosures. And that damn Wilbur Ross he had all these mortgage servicing companies. He was at the center of the robo-signing, which was fraudulent, stealing people's homes. And they're walking around free. I don't know if the statutes of limitations, you're a lawyer, I don't know if the statutes of limitations are run out, but there needs to be some, you know, accounting for that. So those are the 3 things I think about housing. But the main thing is, you know, put the control on rents so people are not being pushed out so fast, but then start building affordable housing. In the city of Vienna in Austria, 60% of the housing is what they call social. It's either owned by the municipal government or it's cooperative, and it's not for profit. And when you have that kind of big social sector, then the for-profit housing, they got to compete with the rents in the non-profit sector. So, you know, those rents don't go real high. The other thing they do in Europe is it's mixed income. They have professionals, working class, single moms without an income, all living in the same projects or developments. And that cross-subsidizes development, so there's less public cost. But it also doesn't segregate. And, you know, we've got more segregated in housing than we were actually going into World War II. And now we got gated communities in the suburbs. And, you know, I'm worried about segregation. The white people in the suburbs don't know that many people of color, and they get, you know, then they're susceptible to the kind of nonsense that Trump spews. And that's, I think, maybe the most dangerous thing about segregation, although you could argue being isolated from opportunities is bad at the other end. But between schools and housing, we've gone the wrong way, particularly since the 1980s. And that's another issue that the Democrats and Republicans don't want to talk about. And I think we're at a point now where actually the racial attitudes have got better for the majority of people. It's just that 1/3 or, you know, 30% of the population, the old white backlash, that, you know, the economic Bill of Rights that the Civil Rights Movement picked up from Roosevelt in the 60s, I mean, Philip Randolph said, we're going to undermine, they had a whole theory, they're going to undermine the material basis for the white backlash by making sure the white folks had the same rights that now the, you know, the Civil Rights Movement was moving from civil rights to human rights, universal economic rights, right to a job, and income above poverty and so forth, the housing. And Randolph said, to secure our civil rights, we got to liberate our white brothers and sisters, you know, economically. I still think that's part of the program. And because we didn't get in the 60s, we got the white backlash in the White House now. But I think demographically, it's a minority. And, you know, the Democrats should crush Trump. I mean, the favorabilities, the demographics, I mean, if they blow this, they can't do anything. You know, the Greens, we got to be there to put these issues out there and get ready. I mean, my argument is we should be electing thousands of people to local offices. There are over 500,000 offices up for election in this country. Most of them are local. We got 150. That's better than any other third party on the left by far, but it's a drop in the bucket. We need to be electing thousands and then to the state legislatures and Congress. And we get a little caucus in Congress and then we run somebody for president, you know, they will be in the media and in the public mind. That's, I think, the program forward. And since we're running out of time, we got to move fast. You know, the climate crisis, the arms race, and inequality.
Okay, we're going to take like one or two more questions. Please, go ahead.
Do you see that there's an undocumented immigration problem, and what's your plan, short and long term, regarding immigration?
Well, give everybody their papers so they can stay. I'm for open borders like they have within the European Union. And, you know, I came up in California, and a lot of people I came up with, you know, their ancestry goes back to when they were in Mexico and they didn't move. The border moved on them. And we have used Mexico like the South African apartheid regime used Bantustans. When you need the labor, you let them in, and then you deport them when you don't want them. And because of that border divide, the working class is divided, and it hurts our workers as well as Mexican workers. So I'm for a slogan that the Prague Spring, Lester Brown used to talk about this, you know, what they were asked, you know, the youth what they wanted in Prague, you know, they were trying to get socialism with a human face. And they said no borders. And I think that's, you know, where we got to be moving toward. Plus, you know, when you look at that eco-socialist Green New Deal we've got a budget now out for, it creates 38 million jobs. 30 million for the green economy reconstruction, you know, zeroing out greenhouse gas emissions, going to 100% clean energy, and 8 million for the economic bill of rights. 5 million of those are the job guarantee, because not everybody can do factory work or construction, which most of the green economy reconstruction is going to be. And about 9 million in manufacturing. And we don't have that many people to do that work. Every time somebody studied seriously how to get to clean energy, it's not been the money, it's not been the technology, it's been the labor. Ross Gelbspan, who was a publisher of the Boston Globe, and he'd been an editor, and he'd been a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, was studying, you know, the climate crisis back in the 90s, and he got some old oil executives retired and some experts from MIT and Harvard, and they did a study, and they found that to move on a time, you know, the time scale we needed, and, you know, this is even before this is before we knew how fast we were going over the cliff. They said labor is the bottleneck. So we don't need borders. We need, you know, people to do a lot of work. And so that's my attitude. You know, freedom of movement is a basic human right. And the UN Charter on Human Rights recognizes within countries, because we've had internal passports. But I think it applies, you know, across the world. And even the libertarians and the economists, you know, the capitalist, you know, magazine, smart capitalist magazine, say, there's studies they cite that say when people are able to move across borders, where they're more productive, the whole economy benefits. So.
Thank Howie for coming, everybody.
Thanks for having me.